Hey everyone, it's me, Aaron, and yeah, by now you've all heard the news. You saw the title card when you clicked on this. You know what this is about. Stan Lee, who I don't have to tell any of you, the co-creator of some of the most memorable comic book characters of all time, who have gone on to be some of the most iconic pop culture figures of all time, thanks to films and television and video games. He has passed away. And this is something that, to be completely honest with you, we all knew eventually one day it had to happen. The man was 95, so for years now we've been hearing about him having health problems, him having hospital scares, him having to cancel conventions, and every single time that happened, I personally always had that thought in the back of my mind, oh my God, this could actually be it. And sadly, he has now finally passed away. Knowing that it was going to eventually happen doesn't necessarily make it any easier. And, you know, I want to come in here and say the man lived to be 95. That's huge. And he lived an incredible life. Not even just with what he did with comics. I mean, the man fought in World War II. He was married to his wife for 70 years. In fact, if you want to know what type of a person Stan Lee was, he married his wife after dating her for 2 weeks, and they flew out to Reno to get a quickie divorce from the man that she was already married to, and then got married on that same day. Stan was a cool guy. So, yeah, I wanted to come in here and make a video kind of expressing my thoughts on Stan Lee, and I know that a lot of people have already done it. I know that this happened days ago at this point. I'm recording this on Tuesday, and I know some people already recorded on the Monday that happened, their thoughts. And, man, you guys are tougher than I am, because I tried recording this yesterday, and I could not get, like, more than a couple words into it before I was like, nope, can't think about, not ready to deal with it just yet. I actually got the news that he passed away like a minute before I had to leave to go to the dentist, and while I was sitting in the dentist waiting room for half an hour, I just kept checking Twitter, and it was taking everything I had to not just burst into tears there in the waiting room. So yeah, it's a heavy thing for anybody in the pop culture community, not even just the people who are like big comic book fans. It is stunning to me how many people's lives Stan Lee affected, what kind of an impact he had on people. Because I'm pretty active on Twitter, and I don't just follow comic book personalities. I follow video game personalities. I follow movie personalities. I follow a bunch of politicians and news reporters. When Stan Lee died, I have not seen that many people talking about the passing of someone since probably Prince, and I might even have seen more people talking about Stan Lee than even that. Not that it's a competition, but there's that old saying that you can tell the value of a person by how many people attend his funeral. These days, you know, what that basically means is you can tell what kind of an impact someone had on the world by looking at the reaction that other people have to their passing, and just seeing so many people from so many walks of life who you would never expect to have like something in common with each other, all kind of coming together to talk about not just, hey man, I read your books when I was a kid, but even like, no, this is why this was specifically important to me. Not just, hey, I like Spider-Man, but no, this is what Spider-Man meant to me. This is what the X-Men meant to me. This is what it meant when I met you in person. I saw Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson tweeting about the passing of Stan Lee, and Mayor Bill de Blasio tweeting about it. I don't think I've ever seen those two guys tweet about the same thing ever. That's the impact that Stan Lee had on such a wide community out there. By the way, speaking of Mayor Bill de Blasio, Mr. de Blasio, if you're watching, and I know you are, you're a huge fan, what do we New Yorkers have to do to get a statue of Stan Lee made? Doesn't even have to be in, like, you know, Central Park or any other big location. It could be on Delancey Street. The comic book fans will get why. Yeah, so it's very clear that you guys don't need me to tell you why Stan Lee was an important figure. If there is anybody out there who the phrase "nuff said" easily describes that person's legacy, it's Stan Lee. We all know the impact that he made. But there's a lot of things that Stan Lee did, especially with the characters that he created, and particularly with what changes he brought to Marvel Comics, that I feel like people aren't really focusing on that much. So I just want to take a quick moment to kind of express sort of the impact that he made that I don't think that many people even realize was Stan Lee. And let me go ahead and say right now, I said he created these characters. Whenever I say he created these characters, you can just picture the little asterisk popping up and saying co-created. Because I fully understand it was not all one person in there. It was him and Ditko. It was him and Kirby. It was him and all the other people from that early time period of comics. And all of them worked together on this stuff, but Stan was kind of that binding string that tied all of them together, which I think is one of the reasons why a lot of people give him so much credit as being like the grandfather of Marvel Comics. But not to kind of go in a negative tone right now, but I know that there's also a lot of people out there who are saying, oh, well, Stan Lee didn't actually do any of this. It was all Kirby. It was all Ditko. It was only them. Lee just put his name on it. And to the people out there who are saying that, I understand why you're saying it, because for decades, people just pointed at Stan Lee and said, oh, he did that all by himself. So they kind of just brushed aside the important impact that Kirby and Ditko and everyone else made. And even Stan Lee himself was guilty of this. Even Stan Lee, for a period of time, was coming in here and basically like, yep, it's all me. And there's a whole lot of financial stuff going in with that, about who got paid for what, and I'm not even going to get into all that. But it is important to note that in his later years, Lee did come back around on this, and he did always want to make sure that everybody else got the credit that they deserved, which I think shows a lot of growth on his part, and I think that's very important. But to the people out there who say that Lee didn't do any of this, you're doing to Lee exactly what the people who say Lee did everything are doing to Kirby and Ditko. Because it's not like Lee just fell asleep on the couch while Kirby did everything, and then Lee came up at the end and went, make sure that I put my name on that. Make sure I had some kind of impact with that. That's not how this went down. They were co-creators. Everybody worked together on this, and you can see the impact that every single different creator had on each of these characters. And that's especially true when it comes to Stan Lee, because there are many things that defines Marvel Comics and have kind of seeped into every other comic book company out there to help define just what comics are in general, that, yeah, you can easily point to Lee and say that is a massive impact that he had on the industry. And the one that really comes to mind right off the bat is that Lee is the guy who looked at comic books and said, I want this to be the real world. I want to have realistic characters. I want to have them dealing with real world issues. I want to try and be more inclusive and reach out to more groups out there. That is something that he was actually famous for doing, and he continued to do it all throughout his entire life. I mean, you look at the X-Men. The X-Men was a group of people who were being discriminated against because they were born differently, and it came out in the 60s. That was pretty darn bold. I mean, that was a book where they would have Sentinels, machines created by the government, coming in to try and attack the mutants because they were just born differently. Yeah, you don't have to write your college thesis on metaphors and literature in order to understand, oh shoot, that was kind of a bold message for him to put into a book at the time. And again, I do understand that was also Kirby and other people who were putting that impact in there, but Lee always really firmly stood behind, I want this to be the real world. And when you look at comic books at the time, during World War II, everybody wanted to create superheroes that existed in the real world because they wanted them to go out there and fight the Nazis. But then, after World War II ended, nobody really wanted that anymore. Everybody wanted lovey-dovey romance books. They wanted sci-fi books. They wanted westerns. They wanted big monster books. Which, that's the period of time in which Lee started working on these books. He started towards the tail end of World War II, and then his editor-in-chief had to just keep coming in there every single day and just like, yeah, we're not doing that anymore. Now we're doing something completely different. And Lee had to just go from one genre to the next, which speaks volumes to what he was capable of. But when it came time to do superheroes again, it was that time when DC was starting to bring superheroes back, but every superhero, their powers were different, but they themselves were kind of the same. Every single superhero in the late 50s, early 60s had one voice. they all just spoke like this. Every single superhero just talked exactly like this. If you read like the really early Flash stuff and the really early Hal Jordan stuff and the Superman stuff of the time and even the Batman stuff of the time, every single one of them is just talking like this. Every single one of them will refer to everyone else as old chum. And they all lived in big mythical cities. They all lived in completely different locations that you couldn't find in your own world. Metropolis, Gotham, sorry, I'm forgetting everyone else at the moment. But you know what I'm talking about right now. They all lived in these fictional locations. Stan Lee came in here and said, I want this to be in New York. And not fictional New York, real New York. In real America, on real planet Earth. We'll throw in there all the fantastic stuff, but I want these characters to feel like they exist in the world outside your door. That was a phrase that he kind of became famous for saying. He wanted Marvel to be that world right outside your door. And you look at things like Spider-Man, which I think is honestly the best example of that. At that point in time, teenage superheroes were not a thing, unless they were a sidekick. You were totally allowed to be a teenage superhero as long as you were a sidekick. You were never allowed to be the front and center main character. And he was like, well, there are teenagers out there. Teenagers who want to be heroes themselves. So we're going to create one for that. And it wasn't like the character he created was Joe everyday American teenage person. It wasn't like he created Archie. It's not like he created like some big pro football star. It's not like he created like teenage version of Johnny Unitas out there. He created Peter Parker, a kid with problems, a kid whose parents just weren't in the picture, who had to be raised by his aunt and uncle, and his uncle got killed because of a mistake that he made, and he kind of was an angry kid when he was first created because he got picked on every single day at school. Yeah, that is not the kind of thing that you would see in comics at the time because it was too dark. It was too real world. I mean, anytime that you look at comics these days and go, okay, it's trying to feel like the real world, you can really trace it all back to Lee trying to bring that all back, to try and make that the central focus of Marvel Comics at the time. At that point in time in comics, it was very rare to see a character whose life was kind of miserable. And if you did see that, typically they'd be the villain, but Stan Lee was the guy who was like, no, there are kids out there like this. There are kids out there who are down on their luck. There are kids who are getting beat up at school. There are kids who are getting teased at school. There are kids who don't have parents to go home to. Yeah, it was really groundbreaking what he was able to do with Spider-Man there. And I realize that I am rambling here, but I also realize that I'm such a jumbled mess of emotions right now that it's kind of impossible for me to actually get this all in a linear structure. But speaking of Spider-Man, again, that's one of those things where a lot of people kind of point Spider-Man and go, well, Lee didn't really have anything to do with that. It was all Ditko, because there were stories that came out that Ditko, many times, Lee would just tell him, we want this to happen in the next book, and he wouldn't get, like, any script, so he would have to actually, like, draw out a complete book by himself, and then Lee would have to come in and basically just add the words in there. He would have to just create dialogue based around what Ditko had already created. So I do want to come in here and make sure that I stress Ditko had a massive impact on Spider-Man, but to the people out there who point at stories like that and say, well, you see, Lee didn't do anything, I think the words behind Spider-Man are some of the most important things about Spider-Man. I mean, Spider-Man having his jokey, quippish nature. Spider-Man having his relationship with J. Jonah Jameson. Spider-Man actually kind of laughing in the face of the villains that are coming at him. That is some of the defining stuff about the personality of Spider-Man. And again, it's the kind of stuff that you wouldn't really get in superheroes at the time. All superheroes at the time, they all spoke with that one voice where they basically just stated the facts about what was happening, and that was that. Spider-Man is one of those first heroes that you can look at and go, that guy had a completely different voice. I do not hear that character's voice coming from Spider-Man. I hear Spider-Man coming from Spider-Man. And the words that he put into that book, like, with great power come great responsibility, that's one of the most important lines in any comic book that's ever been written, and it massively defines who Spider-Man is. Yeah, let's not come in here and try and take that away from Stan Lee. It's huge, the impact that just little things that he did for Spider-Man had on the rest of the industry. Even going into what we have today in books. But okay, I've talked about Spider-Man, I've talked about the X-Men, I've talked about, the impact that he made on trying to make the world feel more realistic and trying to actually get more involved in current politics, which again was a thing where you could have metaphors in books, but Lee would actually have actual things from the real world happening in these books. That was so ahead of its time. That's stuff that we, even to this day, still see people saying, well, I don't want this stuff in my comics. And it's like, Lee was literally doing this stuff back in the 60s. It's kind of been what everything that you read in comics is based on. So, yeah, I'm not going to go too much further into that, but I do just want to come in here and say that Stan Lee's contribution to comics, it even went beyond just what he put in the panel, because after he became the editor-in-chief, so many people talk about the impact that he had in co-creating these characters. I've always said some of the most important moments in Stan Lee's career at Marvel came from after he became editor-in-chief, and the fact that he was able to take the impact and the tone that he was giving to the individual books that he was writing and kind of make that the standard for all of Marvel. But he wasn't just impacting the writing of those books at the time when he was editor-in-chief. I think that Lee, in many ways, when he was the editor-in-chief of Marvel, kind of impacted the entire comic book culture as we know it today. Because you think about how now these days, you might not be so loyal to a character, but you'll be loyal to a writer. You'll say, like, well, that's the writer that I trust. Anything that writer does, I want to check them out. Lee... Sorry, I'm getting really... Alright, Lee was that guy who, when he was editor-in-chief, he created Stan's Soapbox. He created an opportunity for him to actually engage with the readers, actually be able to reach out there and say, hey there, true believers, it's me, Stan Lee. I'm coming here and talking to you about what me, Stan Lee, is doing and what we're doing here at Marvel and all the amazing things happening here at Marvel. And I'm going to address many of the questions that you people at home probably have about what we're doing at Marvel. Yeah, that wasn't really a thing that happened in comics at the time. Stan Lee came out there and said, I want to make sure people know who works at Marvel. And it wasn't just him with his Stan Soapbox. He put the focus on many other people working at Marvel. He made sure that they did spotlights of other people working at Marvel. In fact, any time that he could squeeze the actual people working on these books into an actual issue of these books, he made sure to do it because he wanted to make sure that the people sitting there reading these books at home knew who the people behind the books were. He wanted the people at home to kind of get a feeling of what it was like to be at Marvel. And it was around that time that we started to see a lot of people no longer going, oh, I like this book, I like that book. We saw people actually going, I actually want to go and visit Marvel Comics. I actually want to go and see what it's like where all these people are working, because he actually created this fun environment through the books of what it must be like to work at Marvel Comics. And you think about how now these days we, romanticize not just the characters, but we also romanticize what it must be like to be at DC or be at Marvel or be at Image. Yeah, he was kind of the guy who got that ball rolling. Before then, yes, people knew the individual writers, but only if they were like really big comic book fans. Now even the casual comic book fans was like, oh yeah, Marvel, what makes Marvel different is this thing over here, and oh, I'm starting to know this guy over here. That is a massive impact that he made on the comic book community, and I don't think people give him nearly enough credit for that. But the other main thing that I wanted to address when it comes to the legacy of Stan Lee was that, yes, he co-created all these amazing characters, and he oversaw a lot of the big important developments that happened when he was editor-in-chief over at Marvel. But it doesn't matter how good of a story is that you write. It doesn't matter how amazing the character is that you make. If you can't get people to buy the books, it won't matter. It will just fade away. It will disappear. Stan Lee was the greatest salesman alive. You could give Stan Lee a rock and tell him, you have to go and make people buy this rock, and he would have people buying that rock. He would have people coming back for more rocks. Stan Lee, you think about how everybody is describing him with his catchphrases like "Nuff said," "True believers," "Excelsior." Yeah, that wasn't just him spouting gibberish that happened to turn into a catchphrase. This dude said, if I'm going to get people connected to us here at Marvel, I have to create taglines for Marvel. I have to create just words that when people hear or when they say them to other people, they're basically just promoting Marvel. That's genius. And Stan Lee didn't just sit behind his desk when he was editor-in-chief. When he was editor-in-chief, he went on the news. He went on Hollywood interview shows. He went on game shows, for crying out loud. He went anywhere there was a camera so he could talk about the amazing things that we are doing over at Marvel here, true believers. Yeah, that dude was a salesman. That was the guy who, when Spider-Man got married to Mary Jane, he got an entire Major League Baseball stadium to make it just the wedding special of Spider-Man and Mary Jane. And he made sure that they had a live reenactment of their marriage happen in front of all these baseball fans. Why? Because he wanted to make sure that that got sold. Stan Lee was one of the greatest salesmen of all time. And when you think about what comic books are, when you think about how hard it is to get people in the modern day and era to pick up comics, I mean, back then it was far easier. They were on the spinner racks at every single newsstand that you went to, and there was one on every single corner. But as time goes along, yeah, comic books have become harder and harder to sell. Stan Lee was the guy who made sure we could sell them. Stan Lee was that guy who made sure everybody was talking about Marvel. Everybody wanted to pick up these comic books. Even if you are not a Marvel fan, and you're just strictly like DC, Image, indie books, the reason why comic books are as big as they are today, the reason that they have been successful for so freaking long, is because we had a guy for decades getting out there selling book after book after book. He would have gone door to door to sell these books if he had to. The entire industry is what it is, not even just because of the characters he co-created, because as I said, he co-created them. Someone else could have come in here and completely created these characters as well. But the reason why comic books have been the success that they have been is because Stan Lee was the guy who made sure that they sold. He's the guy who made sure people bought those books. And to me, I honestly think that's the biggest impact that he had on the comic book industry. And when you think about his cameos that he made in all the Marvel movies, that's kind of him still being a salesman. That's kind of him still coming into all these movies and making sure that every single person at home had something to connect to in these movies. When we saw him pop up, it wasn't like, all right, here's the Stan Lee cameo. It was like, hey, it's the Stan Lee cameo. We were all waiting on that thing. Oh, man, makes you feel good inside. Even if it's a bad Marvel film, he would have a good cameo in here. And it just made you like Stan Lee and kind of want to continue just following the adventures of Stan Lee in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but yeah, it was another way of selling these movies, and it's kind of brilliant how they were able to work Stan Lee in there. And Stan Lee was one of those guys who he was always trying to be at the forefront. Whatever the new hot thing was, he wanted a part of that. And for some reason yesterday, I was just thinking about the Sony PlayStation Spider-Man video game that came out. And mild spoiler for that, but he has a Stan Lee cameo in there, and Sony is now saying, yeah, we're not just making Spider-Man games. That is the start of the Marvel video game universe. That is the start of we're basically going to do in the video games what they've been doing in the movies, and I keep looking at that and thinking, wow, it's kind of really speaks to who Stan Lee is, and how he was constantly always striving for that next big thing, that one of his last cameo appearances that he's ever going to make was in the birth of this brand new Marvel universe. He was able to be there to oversee. I'm actually getting teared up again. Okay, sorry, I talked too much about this. He was kind of there at the birth of not just Marvel, not just the Marvel movies, but now even a third Marvel universe. That's amazing to me. But also, Stan Lee just was such an incredible human being. You've been hearing all these personal stories about like advice that he would give to young writers out there when they were just starting out, about the people who were able to interview him and just the warmth that they were able to feel from him. And it is amazing that even for the people who never actually met Stan Lee, he kind of was the entire world's cool uncle. He was that guy who, no matter what was going wrong in your personal life or what was going wrong at home, your cool uncle would show up. He would come in there, give you some sage advice, and make you kind of feel better about the entire world and just make you feel uplifted for a little while. That's who Stan Lee was. Okay, I don't know how much longer I can talk about this before I just really start bawling all over again. But, yeah, I think that's everything that I wanted to cover about Stanley's legacy. I might have over exaggerated some stuff in there because I am kind of emotional at the moment. And I know it was a rambling mess, but honestly, I think when it comes to these emotional videos, rambling mess is the way to go. I am firmly 100% behind rambling mess. So thank you guys for putting up with whatever this was today. And let me know the impact that Stanley made on you guys in the comments down below. Thank you all for tuning in. We are going to still do our regular our regular comic book comic class this week. But it'll probably be going up on Thursday, because I think I might need like an extra day to just kind of like deal with all this. But yeah, thank you guys very much. And Excelsior. I actually told myself, you know what, everybody's been saying Excelsior, you're not going to do it there at the end, everybody's been doing it, and yeah man, it's weird how after talking about Stan Lee, it just feels right. It just kind of makes you want to say that. Bye everyone.